Welcome to today's video. Today's video, I'm going to be telling you what you need to know if you're thinking of buying a used electric car. From my perspective as a used car dealer, I'm going to tell you the stuff that my industry doesn't want you to know to buy a used electric car.
Are you listening? Damn.
The one thing that a lot of people assume about electric cars is they need to check certain things completely differently to a normal car. Well, let me just tell you the first big secret about buying a used electric car is you just basically, most of the stuff you check on it is exactly the same as what you check on a regular, normal petrol or diesel car. There's some bits that we're going to go into in a minute that are particularly different, but the main parts that you need to check are just like you were checking a normal car. So the first part of this video, if you want to skip it, is all about how to check a normal car. But otherwise, I might tell you some industry secrets that I know as a car dealer on how to check a car properly and what you need to look out for. Now, when you're checking a used car, the first thing you want to do is pop the bonnet like you do on a normal car. Now, the one thing that you want to check when you pop a bonnet is you're checking for paint damage, you're checking that it's not had any crashes, and the way you do this is you're basically looking at the paintwork and you're checking the nuts. So for example on here, I'd be going down the bit where the bonnet connects and looking at the bolts, making sure they've not moved, making sure they've not been repainted, making sure they're not damaged. And then at the front of the car here, I'll be checking if the plastic's moved, if the panels have moved, if it looks like it's had a front end push smash that might have damaged part of the car. Now when you're doing this, you're also checking that none of the cables have been moved, none of the cables have been taken out. On a petrol car, you'd obviously be checking if the engine's been damaged, etc. But on an electric car, you're checking that your electric connections have not been damaged. Now, I'd also pop the charge flap here, check inside there, make sure none of that's been damaged, check for corrosion inside the charge flap, make sure that none of it's, looking manky, looking damaged, looking like it's going to have any wear, any rust, any stuff like that. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for general wear and tear on the car, the charge flap, the bits that you're going to use. Now, you wouldn't normally check a petrol cap on a car, but this is the main part of an electric car, is the charge flap. So you want to check for corrosion inside both ports. If it's a Nissan Leaf, you want to check the CHAdeMO port as well as the Type 1 port or Type 2 port if it's a newer one. On the Zoe, you've only got the one charge flap, so you're just checking inside there, making sure for damage. Like I said, just check all the cables, make sure the high voltage cables haven't moved, make sure there's no cracks in them, no visible sign of damage. Now, before I move on to the next part you need to check on an electric car if you're buying one, first of all, can I ask you just to do a couple of things for me, really, really important things. One, can you please go down the bottom right, there's a button that says subscribe, big red button, please click that, and there's a little notification bell next to it. If you click that, you'll be notified every time I make a new video, which just basically stops you from missing any content. You don't have to click it, but it will notify you every time I make one and every time I go live, which I will be going live very shortly for Fully Charged Live. And I want you to all join in the conversation at Fully Charged Live. That'll be really great. Also, if you've got any friends, family, anything like that who are thinking of buying an electric car, then send them this video, this in particular video. It's all about buying a used electric car and it really might help them start their journey on buying an electric car. Now, this might seem very obvious, but you need to check the tyres. There's proper ways of checking the tyres. You can buy a little depth measurer that measures how deep the tyre is. You can do that, but the easiest way of doing it is if you look inside the tyre, there's little nodules, little grooves, and where those grooves are, you're pretty much at the legal limit. Now, when you're checking a tyre, you need to press across the board. So you need to check the very inside, the very outer, and then the middle. You need to make sure you've got even wear pretty much all across the tyre. Now, if you're looking at buying a Renault Zoe in particular, I can tell you now that these tyres scrub really badly here. So check the front tyres here, make sure they're not scrubbed. If they're scrubbed, they're probably getting due for replacement and need replacement. The other important thing to check a tyre that no one ever looks for is cracks. Check for cracks on the inside of the groove. That means basically the rubber cracking. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the tyre's knackered now, but it means it's very old. So the next thing you need to do, on the side of the tyre, there is a 4-digit code, which is the date the tyre was made. It will tell you how old the tyre is. Now, if it's got cracks in the middle, it's likely a tyre that's been on the car since new, and means that you're probably getting close to replacing it just due to it being old and the rubber being more perishable, and it's also likely to lose a lot of pressure as well if it's got cracks down the middle. Well, the next obvious thing to do is take the car for a drive. And the reason why we do this is because we are checking for knocks, bangs, faults, basically to make sure the car's driving exactly as you'd expect it would. We don't want the car to making any noises inside, so making sure the suspension, the bush arms, everything like that drives normal. So just like a normal car, you take it for a drive, you make sure it all works. You try drive, you try reverse, you make sure you try the range of what's available on the automatic gearbox and make sure everything works as intended, and that you give the car a good run up a bypass. Basically, you want to get it to motorway speed. You're checking for judder on the steering wheel to make sure the wheels are balanced correctly. Basically just checking that everything works exactly as you'd expect a normal car would. The next thing to check is make sure you've got cables, the cables that you need for the car. Now, on certain cars, certain cables come included. On a Zoe, you get a Type 2 to Type 2 cable included. On Nissan Leaf, you can get a Type 2 to Type 1 cable or a Type 2 to Type 2 depending on the year of the car, and you might also have a 3-pin granny cable included with the car. Renault Zoes didn't come with granny cables. They came with just Type 2 to Type 2, but the person selling it might also have an EVSE charger with it. If they haven't, you can buy one second hand. There's one down below in my description for a Zoe or any electric car we're using a Type 2, and I think that's, at the moment, last time I checked on Amazon, was about £200. But if you use the link down below, I'll get referral credit. Every time someone uses one of my Amazon links, Amazon pay me money, which goes towards making more videos. So you can go and buy a granny cable down below. Now, on the BMW i3, it only came with a 3-pin granny cable, but most people were able to negotiate with their dealer a Type 2 to Type 2 cable. On the Zoe, one thing to check when you get your Type 2 to Type 2 cable, it's either going to be the original Zoe cable, which is looking like this, or a blue cable with the same end. If it's not an original cable, you need to check one thing, you need to check its 3-phase. And to check its 3-phase, if we stare right down here, you need to check all those pins have got connections in, and the reason is Zoe uses 3-phase 22 kilowatts and 43 kilowatts depending on what motor you've got. If you want to learn how to tell what motor the Zoe has and what speed it charges at, there's a link top right, a very old video I did when I first started doing YouTube, which will explain how to do that for you. So you're taking it for a drive, you've checked the cables, you've checked the bodywork. So far everything seems great. But Nick, you've not told me, really, apart from the cables, how to check anything to do with the electrics. Well, this is where we get into the main part. You need to open the charge flap, take it to a charger and plug it in. Now on a Zoe, you need to check two things. You need to check it charges on single phase, so a home charger, granny cable, something like that. Then if you can, I know it's not extremely possible depending on where you're charging, but try and charge it on a 3-phase supply. So that's a 22 kilowatt charger or a 43 kilowatt charger. The reason you need to do this is if the Zoe has a fault on one of the phases on the 3-phase, it won't charge, and you won't find out until you go to an electricity charger or a 22 kilowatt charger. If it charges on 22 kilowatts, it will charge on 43 kilowatts. If it charges on single phase granny cable, it'll charge at a single phase at home granny cable. So you just need to double check those things. Now, if you've got a Nissan Leaf, which has combo chargers, or a i3 which has the DC combo CCS charger, you need to check that really the CCS on the i3, so the 2 phases at the bottom work, and on the Nissan Leaf you need to check that the CHAdeMO works. The reason we're checking this, we're making sure there's no internal faults on the electric wiring. We've checked there's no corrosion, but we need to make sure it's charging. Does it charge on all the phases? DC, AC, just check it all. Now before we get into the next thing, I want to ask you, the watchers who've already got these EVs, what have you got to tell us to look out for on an EV? If you're a Nissan Leaf driver, BMW i3 driver, Hyundai, if you are an owner of another electric car and you know of common faults, leave them down in the comments below so people can find out. Or what do you think that people should look out for on electric cars? It's important that as a community we work together and try and figure out what are the common faults on various cars. Now, leading into this, if you join a owners club like the Renault Zoe Owners Club, which is free, Nissan Leaf group on Facebook, etc., you can ask other owners what common faults are and what to look out for, and there's a valuable resource of owners and past owners on there with information that you just couldn't imagine to get anywhere else. Even Googling all this information would just drive you nuts. So if you go on there, there's owners that live with the car every single day and they can usually tell you what the common faults are. For example, like I mentioned before, on the Zoe it's the front tyres, and on the Leaf it's various other little bits, but you just need to go and speak to some owners and they will tell you exactly what they find as faults on the car. Now let's move on to the internals. Check the heater works. On the Zoe it's a heat pump. If the aircon doesn't work, then it's usually got a leak in it, which means the heater doesn't work. So check the heater works, make sure it gets warm, make sure it gets very cold, ice cold. In the summer you want to check that it gets freezing cold, ice cold, which means the aircon's working. In the summer you want to make, in the winter, sorry, you want to make sure it's getting warm. Now the Zoe heater doesn't get hot, as in really hot, but it does get warm. If it's warm, it's working. If it gets freezing cold, it's working. So you want to check that on all electric cars, Nissan Leafs, the whole lot. Just make sure that's working. Test the preheat on the key, make sure that works and it's preheating and it's receiving the signal off there. These are really important things. Also check that the connection to the connected services work. So if the owner has the car or if it's a dealer, make sure that the app's working. Now if it's a dealer, they're not going to have the app set up. But what you'll be able to do on most cars is check that there's a connected service to the server and make sure it's communicating, and that means that your connected service will work. If that isn't important to you, it might be important to when you come to sell it, so make sure you check it. Check the SD cards in the car, make sure it's there, because if it's got an SD card for the maps, you need it there really. You might not be that bothered about it, but when you come to sell it, people will want to know it works, so make sure it's there. Same with the connected services, make sure that it's connected, make sure it's talking to the app servers. It's a very important part to know on this car. The other thing, when you're checking stuff like mirrors and lights, try not to make it too obvious that you're checking all the mirrors work and all the lights work and all the windows work, because when you're buying a car for someone, they can find this a little bit irritating. So the best thing to do, the best thing I do, is when I test drive, just put the window up and down, move the mirrors up and down, adjust the mirrors for when you're driving for the test drive. This allows you to check the electrics without making it look like you're going through their car trying to find faults. Because you're not trying to find faults, you're trying to make sure it works. But when you're looking for faults, people who are selling the car can find it a little bit frustrating. So the best way of doing it is doing it subconsciously, making sure that, you know, they are working, but you're doing it in a manner that seems very natural. Now the next one I almost didn't include in this video, but after speaking to some owners, they considered it an important issue. But me personally, I don't think this is this important, and that is service history. So if it's important to you, check the service histories there for the car. But to be honest, on an EV, a service isn't really anything. It's just nothing. It's a nothing service. On a Renault Zoe, they are due a brake fluid change at 4 years, but normally most people will check the brake fluid with a water test to make sure it's fine. The brake fluid service on this is every 4 years, and it requires a new 12-volt battery at the front every 3 years. Now again, most people will check the 12-volt battery and see that they're fine, but usually the 12-volt battery will need changing on the 4th or 5th year. So just check that has been done if that's important to you. But normally, if the car's sort of starting and running fine, most people won't bother with a 12-volt, just like you wouldn't be bothered on a normal car. An EV will always pretty much reboost the 12-volt battery unless it gets to a point where it's really bad, and then the car literally will not start. The important part of noting about service history is on certain cars it's annually every 12 months. On a Zoe it's every 12 months for 18,000 miles, and the Nissan Leaf follows a very similar service schedule. To me, like I said, it's not an important issue. I'd still buy an EV without any service history, but this is where it does actually come important. If it's still under warranty, some manufacturers can be very, very finicky if their car's not been serviced. So if it is under warranty, check that the service history is up to date. If it's not up to date, speak to the manufacturer and make sure that they're happy to cover the car for the warranty if you then take it in for the next service, as in the week you buy it. Now you'll notice I've not spoke about this thing under here, and that is the main traction battery. And the reason I've not talked about that is, personally, I've never seen an electric car with a bad traction volt battery. But if it's something that's bothering you, you can get Leaf Spy for Nissan, and you can get ZE, CAN ZE for the Renault Zoe. If you are getting a dongle, there's a link for the dongle down below in the description on Amazon, a dongle that works with both these tools. But personally, I wouldn't worry about it too much, especially if you're buying a Renault Zoe, which is on battery lease, which means the battery's covered if it fails anyway. But don't worry too much about this thing. Electric car batteries are extremely reliable. The next thing to know is do a HPI check. Make sure there's no outstanding finance on the vehicle. You don't want to buy a vehicle that's got finance, it won't be yours. Battery lease cars will have a securement from the battery lease company in saying that they basically got a battery lease contract, but check it is a battery lease contract, don't take the owner's word for it, and make sure finance is cleared off before you buy the car. Thanks very much for watching this week's video. Don't forget to click subscribe, consider becoming a patron, and check out my other videos. I'll see you again next week. Goodbye.